Imagine a colleague who is extraordinarily charming in their first month. They have the ability to read people with unusual accuracy, always knowing exactly what to say. They project confidence so seamlessly that others defer to them without quite understanding why. They're decisive in ways that others describe as visionary. They take credit with ease and assign blame with equal ease. They feel no visible anxiety in high-pressure situations. And they have advanced within the organization faster than anyone can quite explain. You may have met this person. You may be working for them right now. The clinical term for this pattern is psychopathy, and contrary to the cultural image of the isolated serial killer, psychopaths are substantially more likely to be found in a corner office than in a prison cell. Research estimates that approximately 1% of the general population meets clinical criteria for psychopathy. Among corporate senior leadership, that estimate rises to roughly 4%. Among CEOs of major corporations, some researchers have proposed figures as high as 21%, though these estimates are contested and difficult to verify. The direction of the research is not. Robert Hare, the Canadian psychologist who developed the most widely used clinical tool for assessing psychopathy, the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, or PCLR, has been studying the condition for over 40 years. His collaboration with organizational psychologist Paul Babiak, documented in their book Snakes in Suits, found that corporate psychopaths don't just reach senior positions. They're selected for them by exactly the features of modern corporate hiring and promotion systems that are supposed to identify the best candidates. What does psychopathy actually look like clinically? The PCLR measures 20 traits across two broad factors. Factor 1 covers interpersonal and affective features, superficial charm, grandiose self-worth, pathological lying, manipulation, lack of remorse, shallow affect, callousness, and failure to accept responsibility. Factor 2 covers the antisocial lifestyle, impulsivity, irresponsibility, early behavioral problems, and criminal versatility. In corporate contexts, Factor 1 traits dominate, while Factor 2 traits are modulated or concealed. The result is what Babiak calls a successful psychopath, one who has learned to channel the traits into socially acceptable behavior. The neuroscience of psychopathy reveals why these traits are so stable and so difficult to detect. Neuroimaging studies have consistently found reduced gray matter volume and activity in the amygdala, the brain region centrally involved in processing fear, empathy, and emotional responses to others' distress. The psychopathic brain sees a person in pain and the amygdala responds with significantly less activation than in neurotypical individuals. This is not a choice. It is a structural difference. The emotional thermostat runs lower. The reduced emotional response produces a set of functional advantages in specific contexts. High-stakes negotiations that produce anxiety in neurotypical participants produce calm in individuals with high psychopathic traits. Fear of rejection or social disapproval, which inhibits most people from making bold requests or aggressive demands, is attenuated. The ability to maintain a calm, confident presentation when most people would be visibly stressed is often read by observers as exceptional composure and leadership capacity. It may be neither. It may be a fundamental difference in emotional architecture. Kevin Dutton, a research psychologist at Oxford who has studied psychopathy extensively, describes what he calls successful psychopathy as the deployment of the syndrome's adaptive features, charm, confidence, decisiveness, focus, emotional coolness, without its full destructive expression. His interviews with high-functioning individuals who score high on psychopathic traits found that many describe their condition not as a disorder but as an advantage. I can make the decisions other people can't bring themselves to make. Whether this framing is accurate or self-serving rationalization is an empirical question. The Hare-Babiak research on corporate psychopathy identified a specific pattern they called management psychopathy, characterized by the ability to create highly positive first impressions in structured settings like job interviews. Psychopaths excel at reading evaluators and calibrating their presentation accordingly. Research by Leanne Ten Brink at the University of California, Berkeley found that individuals scoring high on psychopathic traits performed better in mock job interviews than controls when interviewers were given insufficient time to assess them. Speed disadvantages normal candidates and advantages psychopathic ones. The organizational environments most vulnerable to corporate psychopathy share identifiable features. Rapid growth or restructuring creates opportunities for individuals who can navigate chaos and power vacuums. Hierarchical cultures where deference to authority suppresses critical evaluation of leaders. High-performance environments that valorize results over process and ethics. And cultures where charm and visibility are rewarded over genuine technical competence. These features describe a substantial proportion of modern corporate environments, which may explain why the base rate of psychopathic traits in senior leadership exceeds the population average. The pattern Babiak documented in longitudinal research involves what he calls a three-phase cycle. In Phase 1, the assessment phase, the psychopathic individual identifies key power holders, potential allies, and potential threats. They invest intensively in impression management with people who matter, while paying little attention to those they assess as unimportant. In Phase 2, the manipulation phase, they build a network of relationships based on manufactured trust, positioning themselves as indispensable while directing credit upward and blame downward. Phase 3, abandonment, occurs when the utility of the current position is exhausted, when detection becomes likely, or when a more advantageous opportunity presents. The relationships built in Phase 2 are discarded, sometimes with striking efficiency. Former allies find themselves isolated. People who trusted deeply feel used, often unable to articulate exactly what happened or who made it happen. The corporate psychopath has moved to the next target while their former network tries to understand the aftermath. The dark triad, psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism, frequently co-occurs in successful corporate manipulators. Narcissism provides the grandiosity and hunger for status that drives advancement. Machiavellianism provides the strategic, ends justify means approach to social maneuvering. Psychopathy provides the emotional insulation that makes executing the strategy comfortable. Together, the three traits form a profile that is remarkably well adapted to competitive, unregulated hierarchical environments and remarkably destructive to them once established. The actual organizational impact of psychopathic leadership has been studied in several large-scale surveys. Research by Nathan Brooks at Bond University found that psychopathic traits in leadership positively correlated with short-term financial performance but negatively correlated with employee well-being, turnover rates, and long-term organizational health. The psychopathic leader frequently produces results at significant human cost, with significant organizational fragility as a downstream consequence. The results get credited. The damage gets attributed to other causes. The 2008 financial crisis has been analyzed through the lens of corporate psychopathy by several researchers. The risk tolerances, ethical flexibility, and disregard for downstream consequences displayed by leadership at several major financial institutions are consistent with high psychopathic trait profiles. Whether or not specific individuals met clinical criteria, the cultures those leaders built actively selected for psychopathic behaviors and suppressed dissent from those who expressed concern about the risks being accumulated. How do you identify one? The research points to a few reliable signals. Sustained, consistent charm that feels performative rather than spontaneous, calibrated too precisely for whoever is in the room. Asymmetric relationships where they know significantly more about you than you know about them. A pattern of taking credit for shared successes and deflecting blame after failures. Reactions to criticism that skip the normal range of defensiveness and move directly to cold calculation. And a trail, if you can trace it, of people who describe interactions that started warmly and ended with an experience they can't quite process. Organizational defenses against corporate psychopathy tend to cluster around a few categories. Structured hiring processes that extend evaluation periods and include diverse assessors are harder for psychopaths to exploit than brief, high-charisma interviews. Reference processes that contact people specifically not listed by the candidate, former peers rather than selected references, are more revealing. Cultures that reward ethical conduct explicitly and visibly, and that creates psychological safety for expressing concern about leader behavior, reduce the organizational vulnerability. It's important to distinguish psychopathy from other presentations that can superficially resemble it. High introversion, depression, trauma responses, autism spectrum characteristics, and cultural differences in emotional expression can all produce presentations that might trigger false pattern recognition. The actual clinical assessment of psychopathy is complex, requires trained professionals, and should not be replicated by armchair diagnosis in organizational settings. What is warranted is attention to behavioral patterns over time, across contexts, and with multiple observers. The evolutionary question, why does psychopathy persist at roughly 1% of the population when it would seem to undermine the social cooperation that benefits everyone, has a straightforward frequency-dependent answer. At low prevalence, individuals with psychopathic traits can exploit the trust and cooperative norms of the majority with significant advantage and minimal detection. At higher prevalence, the strategy stops working because the social environment adapts. Evolution has settled on an equilibrium around roughly 1%. It is a stable, if uncomfortable, ecological niche. What makes this topic genuinely uncomfortable is not the corporate psychopath themselves, rare, distinctive, eventually identifiable. It's the systems that reward them. Because systems optimizing for confident presentation over demonstrated competence, for short-term results over long-term sustainability, for individual impression management over collective well-being, these systems don't just fail to screen out psychopathic traits. They select for them. Changing the prevalence of these traits in leadership requires changing what we reward, what we measure, and what we call success. The dark psychology of corporate life isn't primarily about the rare individuals who score at the clinical threshold. It's about the ordinary incentive structures that distribute advantage toward darker personality traits and punish the vulnerability, uncertainty, and moral complexity that genuine leadership requires. The most psychologically healthy leaders are often the least confident, the most uncertain, the most willing to say "I don't know." In environments designed to reward the opposite, they rarely win. Understanding why that is and what it costs is where the real psychology of organizational life lies. Psychopaths are not a new phenomenon in human organizations. History provides ample examples across every era and every institutional type. What's new is the scale and speed at which modern corporations allow psychopathic influence to propagate and the degree to which behavioral science has now documented exactly how this happens. That documentation creates, for the first time, the possibility of organizational design that doesn't inadvertently invite what it most needs to prevent. Whether the knowledge is applied depends on whether the people with the power to apply it find it in their interest to do so. There is, perhaps, some irony in that.